John Jay in 1786, George Washington entertained no doubt that it is necessary to revise and amend the Articles of Confederation. He stated that ignorance and design are difficult to combat. Out of these proceed improper jealousies and a train of abuses, which oftentimes in Republican governments must be sorely felt before they can be removed.
The Articles, designed to unite the states during the Revolutionary War, were not intended to create a strong national government, but rather to provide for the states' common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, as delineated in Article 3. While they were necessary to sever the states' ties from Great Britain and attract legitimate international recognition, the Articles proved inadequate as a governing document after the war because several provisions made them difficult to enforce.
Article 5 delineates that in Congress assembled, each state shall have one vote, but Article 9 made it nearly impossible for it to pass any legislation, as a supermajority of 9 states was needed to pass laws. Without the assent of 9 states, Congress could not make treaties, coin, regulate, and borrow money, or request funds for the general welfare.
When Congress did request payment, the states were under no obligation to actually provide them to the central government, since there were not enforced taxes and the country plunged into debt. The Congress did have the power to enter treaties and alliances. However, they could not make treaties of commerce or regulate trade amongst the states. Pursuant of their own self-interest, neighboring states began tariff wars against one another, further dividing the nation.
The Article's heavy limits on Congress demonstrate a distrust of strong national government, which is also seen in their lack of a strong executive. Article 9 declares that the congressional representatives shall appoint one of their number to preside over meetings of the Congress, but this president did not have executive power. Additionally, Article 6 mandated that no vessels of war and no body of forces be kept up in time of peace, thus rendering the nation without a standing army.
While the lack of a strong national government eventually led to the Articles' downfall, this fear of too much centralized authority was justified in the people's minds. This preliminary government was adopted in 1777, just 1 year after the colonies had declared their independence from the tyrannical King George III. Having grown accustomed to salutary neglect in the years prior to the 7 Years' War, the colonies were angered by England's refusal to respect their state legislature's sovereignties and rejected the legislative actions of Parliament, which they saw as arbitrary.
Several acts, such as the Proclamation Act, the Declaratory Act, and the Intolerable Acts, violated the colonies' charters and repealed elected governors and replaced them with those appointed and loyal to the king. Additionally, colonists' rights to trial by jury of their peers and due process were not upheld. The colonists despised these violations of their rights as they subscribed to Rousseau's social contract theory, believing his assertion that every man is born free and master of himself. No one else may under any pretext whatsoever subject him without his consent.
They also trusted that under smaller, more localized governments, the interest of the public is easier perceived, better understood, and more within the reach of every citizen, as articulated by Baron de Montesquieu. The Articles, therefore, sacrifice strong national authority for the security of state governments. This fear of a large, distant national government still exists today. According to November 2015 Pew Research Center poll, only 19% of Americans trust the government always or most of the time. Most citizens who distrust the government liken its current actions to those of a tyrant king.
Senator Rand Paul compared Obamacare to the Stamp Act, accusing it of forcing the people to pay a tax that not all consented to, and thus breaking the social contract theory. Others agree with the anti-federalist arguments that state governments are more responsive to their citizens and are more capable of governing. In the 2015 Every Student Succeeds Act, which repeals many of the provisions of the No Child Left Behind Act and relinquishes power to regulate the education to the states, is an example of this idea.
When taking into account the various infringements of rights by the national government throughout history, such as the judicial branch's ruling in favor of Japanese internment in Korematsu v. U.S., and the legislative branch's suspension of habeas corpus for any suspected terrorists under the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, distrust of the national government is often justified. James Madison wrote in his notes on the Philadelphia Convention that all men have power ought to be distrusted to a certain degree. We agree with this assertion and believe that it is necessary to hold some distrust of a strong national government in order to ensure that it will serve the people justly. Thank you.
450.
To what extent did the Articles protect rights?
One may argue that the Articles protected the citizens' right to basic liberty and freedom of speech, but it also constricted the national federal government so much that even though the rights of citizens were protected, such as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and property, honestly, the federal government couldn't really do anything to expand on those rights given already.
The articles also focused many of the powers, or relinquished many of the powers to states, and thus gave the states' constitutions, they had many of the rights instead of the Articles of Confederation.
Additionally, there's Article 2, I believe, that guaranteed citizens their freedoms to their privileges and immunities across all states, so they could travel to either state and have the same rights that they had in their state of residence.
However, Article 4 protects a lot of rights of states instead of protecting the rights of the citizens, because the articles were designed to act upon the states as opposed to the citizens.
Additionally, the articles made all these declarations in Article 2 about what perhaps rights citizens had, but they had no enforcement power, and the states chose to accept them or not. So in terms of the articles specifically protecting rights, they had no enforcement power of doing so.
What do you think? I know you haven't gone into it in depth, but Governor Abbott's idea on his Texas plan of returning states' rights, giving them more states' rights. What do you think about that idea?
I think his idea to limit the federal government is a good one. However, his specific 9 points that he wanted, 9 amendments that he proposed, they're very vague, and especially I think it was point 7, in which federal or state officials have the right to bring federal officials into court whenever they want to. You're just going to see a bunch of state officials suing like Obama or like people and bringing them into court over these issues like that. So there are some parts of his plan that don't make any sense, but I think the overall idea is justified.
One of his amendments was to give the states the power to overturn Supreme Court decisions, which takes away power from the Constitution and undermines the national government's authority and the supremacy clause of Article 6.
Is what's going on in Oregon with or Nevada rancher Armin Bundy legitimate? And what I mean by that is the biggest argument that they're making is that the federal lands that are in these western states, because of their vastness, should go back to be managed by the states themselves. Is that a legitimate argument? And I'm going to give you that fact when I say the state of Nevada just sold the federal government 10,000 acres last week back to the federal government.
This argument can be seen as legitimate, as certain states and certain citizens of states, such as Bundy, believe that their state government should have the rights to regulate the land that is within their state. However, a lot of land in the West Coast is owned by the national government, and the national government can do with that land whatever it chooses, such as store nuclear waste on it. So citizens in these states worry about the health and the benefits of their citizens, which the national government cannot perceive from the distance that it is at.
It could also be a cause of concern the management of these lands for the grazers. Many of the local farmers or sheep herders or whatever, they know the intricacies of the land and how to manage it properly. And I believe if the government takes too much control of that, then it could be misused and harmed in an invisible way.
This claim isn't exactly justified in the fact that in Oregon in 1934, the government bought the lands off of the ranchers because they weren't running it well enough, and a lot of things were going wrong. So this argument would be that since the states themselves can't really regulate land that well, and it hasn't been historically been a good thing for states to do that, the federal government should maintain its control over it.
Historically speaking, what do you think the most important reason was the Articles of Confederation failed?
I would argue that the most important reason the Articles failed was that they were not intended to create a strong national government. They were created very quickly in order to unite the states so that they could win this war against England, because they needed the support from France and other nations. And without the Articles, they wouldn't have gotten international support. So when the framers of the Articles created the Articles, they create a nation that could stand on its own. They were only intending to win the war.
Time, keep going.
I believe that it failed because of its complete equal representation. With this, 9 out of 13 states were required to pass any laws, and all 13 were required to amend the articles, which was desperately needed. And many people today complain that our own Congress, which is much different from that, already have enough gridlock when it comes to Planned Parenthood and Obamacare, but the articles passed little to nothing, and like with the exception of the Northwest Ordinance.
Additionally, there was an ideological block, like we discussed in our paper. The states believed themselves to be independent. They believed that was the best way for them to function. And so when they joined this Articles of Confederation, this League of Friendship, they never intended to have things enforced at a national level. They always intended to have the states alone enforcing and passing legislation that was pertinent to them. So this was an ideological failure, and that's why it failed. They didn't ever recognize a national authority.
You guys need to make the testimony more current to what has happened in the last few weeks. You use that Pew Research from November, and you can use the Governor Abbott's proposal. You can use the Oregon issue. The other thing that you guys could also talk about is we still have 5 minutes.
Oh.
Thank you. Is what had happened in the Midwest last week. They flooded.
Oh, yeah.
Who's going to come in and save the states then? Oh, but we should give it all back to the states.
Well, is there a way for the states to regain their territory? Like is there a system like payouts?
The state of Nevada, in its original constitution, said it belongs to the people of the United States forever. That's in the words of the Nevada State Constitution. And because I love when Bundy goes, "This is my land. I've been here since 1875." Well, that was written in 1864 before we ever had those lands. That's number one. But the other thing is, and you guys brought it up in cross-ex, is that a lot of times the land managers don't necessarily know the land very well. And so can they do it themselves? And one of the big arguments on that is the trying to protect the greater save grouse, is that? Mm-hmm. And that is actually, they've had some success in local management of that so it doesn't go into the federal endangered species list. So using those types of things back and forth, because this is hard, there's no answer, there's no easy answer. Right? If we have a massive flood, the state of Nevada couldn't pay for it, couldn't help us, but the federal government could. There's a major earthquake. This also goes back to something you guys talked about with the 17th Amendment in the House of Representatives. Why is the nuclear waste dump put in the state of Nevada? We don't have the representation in Congress, especially the House, to prevent it. But why has it never become a nuclear waste dump?
Because of the Senate.
Because of Harry Reid. Right? The power of Harry Reid has kept it from coming here because of
So as soon as
equal
it's gone,
representation.
will it be here?
It could be. That is a major fear of a lot of people in the state of that.
Tell him never to retire.
So
Make him immortal.
those are really those you guys really have to take the contemporary issues in this and to really know them. So you got to pay attention to anything that has to do with states going on. Okay?
One of the flip sides is I'd have a percentage of how much federal land is in eastern states versus
Western states.
Maybe 1 or 2 examples so you know that, because the eastern states, it's
Well, like-
much less than in the western
Well, in
states.
Nevada, we own so little of our land.
Well, I would have those numbers on the top here, maybe compare it with New York or.
Okay.
So what do they do on federal land?
Well, then
Anything?
it belongs to me.
Yeah, you go.
Do whatever you want.
You go bike riding.
Go bike riding, do whatever you want.
run,
Nevada has the
hiking.
most, we have the most public land.
But this is another.
Is it more than Alaska?
In the
Yeah.
West, we hate the BLM.
Well, I don't,
Bureau of Land Management. They're the ones who run the federal land. Who do they hate on the East Coast? EPA. EPA.
Oh,
Environmental
yeah.
Protection Agency. These are much more industrial, right? So they have their own arguments for who they hate in the federal government is the EPA.
So we should come up with current examples for, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, currently.
And the thing for the EPA is a lot of rivers for them, because there's so many more rivers on the East Coast that really governs a lot of the things that happen on the East Coast, as well as factories in there and those types of things.
Formatsu. Don't say whatever.
President Obama,
Obamacare is the
I would
Affordable
say,
Care Act.
I would say the Every Child for Success thing, maybe say that for cross-ex, cause you need to cut it 50 seconds. That's a great cross-ex example.
You two, anything else?
Go ahead. Are you sure? I really liked your guys' answer to Colonel's question. I liked all the different ways you took it. Something that always really fires me up, that Unit 2 brings it up though, is when you contrast like the perpetual union or the more perfect union in the Constitution versus the Articles of Confederation. So that's just something I like.
I like that too.
It's nice.
I like the League of
Take it or
Friendship.
leave it.
The firm league of friendship.
Is that a thing?
Yes,
Yeah,
Says
it was the
Yeah.
Articles of
He's
Confederation.
He's firm in his pants. He's firm in his
Something
conviction. He's a firm in his
I like that.
I can't use that, Hannah?
I would just say that it states this question is either going to go one of two ways. The judges are all going to be really super fascinated here for the historical book and ask you a bunch of questions about the articles, or they're going to be like super targeted and ask you how is all of that still relevant today? The conflict between federal powers and state powers.
So be fair for everything.
Well, I was going to say you definitely do a lot more research into content because you have one answer that fits any possible question that they can ask you about the articles. Because I had like 4 questions, and the simple answer that, well, the articles weren't really supposed to create a strong national. They weren't supposed to create a government itself. They were just supposed to be there so that foreign nations had something to say. Okay, I can enter into a treaty with you now.
To win the war.
Exactly, which is why, that's why it didn't do a lot of stuff that we have up under the Constitution. That's why there's like no limiting clauses in the articles that say states can't do this, government can't do this.
I think to cut down, cut the part of where we talk specifically about like the declaratory acts and the intolerable acts and whatnot.
You have to cut 50 seconds.
It asks for historical reasons. I'm gonna distrust
I
that.
know, anybody
We
else?
can,
I mean, we
we'll
can cut
figure it
them,
out.
but like,
Because we mentioned like,
yeah, we'll figure it out. This testimony needs a lot of work.
This was the most recent written, so it needs the most work.
My argument is always going to be that salutary neglect is the reason for the articles.
Yeah.
That salutary neglect made give them a false sense of security that they could do it on their own. But Great Britain was always there. They just forgot.
Do you guys think that you might just be able to say it in less words? Because you like list out all
Yeah,
of the
well,
acts, and then you
yeah.
pause, and you're like, and they suspended the right to trial, and they did that. I think you might just be able to cut some of it and be like, they did a lot of crappy things.
Yeah, if you
This is
don't, if
why.
you don't want to cut any actual material, just see if you can shorten the
Just
focus
yeah,
on
no,
You
we'll-
can come in.
for just everything. Look at all the things that you can shorten.
Are you gonna?
You guys want R4? You guys want R4 or do you want 3?
You know, I like to get shit
Where's the
going
start?
somewhere too.
She has more important than I do.
I like one. That's straws broke the camel's back.
4 to 5. Great.